All right, let's do it. Okay, we are going to be talking about aggregate spending. We're also going to be talking about aggregate income. These are two ways that we're able to calculate GDP. Aggregate spending is by far the one you will use most commonly for AP Macro. So, first thing, GDP equals C plus IG plus G plus XN. You need to memorize this formula. We will use it again and again and again. And I'll go through and define what each of these is, and we'll go in further detail in later slides. So C is consumption, the IG is gross private investment, G is government spending, and XN is net exports. And if you remember from before, net exports is equal to exports minus imports. Okay, let's break it down letter by letter. So consumption. This is consumer or household spending, so households from the circular flow. On durable goods, cars and appliances, things that we hope will last for reasonable amounts of time before they need to be replaced. Non-durable goods, food, clothing, although with clothing these days, fast fashion, clothes seem to last even shorter periods of time. And the last thing would be services. So plumbing, going to college, accountancy, legal advice, all of those things would be in the services category. So for durable goods and non-durable goods, remember, both of these need to be new. So they don't count used goods because we exclude those from GDP. In the United States, consumer spending or household spending is up to 70% of GDP, which is significant. So if the US consumer slows down or stops spending, this is typically bad for the US economy, but also bad for a lot of countries that export a lot of goods to the United States. So if the US consumer starts buying less, those countries start exporting less, and it has a chain reaction effect on economies around the world. Second one, gross private investment, IG. Typically this is spending undertaken by firms or businesses, but remember in economics we like to use the word firms, to increase their future output or productivity. In English, what does this mean? It means that they're including spending on capital, so new tools, new machines, new factories, things that will allow them to produce more goods and services in the future, or maybe improve their productivity. So if they equip their workers with better tools on the production line or in their factories, those workers can be more effective. So that one worker with new tools is able to produce more than they were before. It also includes new construction. Now the tricky thing, and something you need to remember, is this includes new construction on buildings and apartments and things like that, but also single family residential houses. So houses that regular families or households live in. So normally you would think that a household, the house that they're living in, would be included in C, but in this case it's included in IG. So this is tricky, and please make sure to remember it. The last thing is the change in unsold inventories. So what this typically means is if a firm produces something and they put it in the warehouse but they haven't found a customer to buy it yet, that is included in GDP. But when the product is finally sold to the consumer, it is reduced from GDP so that we're not counting it twice. Because we count it the first time when it goes into inventory, but then as it's reduced, it's actually sold and taken from inventory. We don't want to double count, so it's then reduced at that point. Again, not something that comes up too often, but just something to bear in mind. So inventories, again, maybe a little bit more detail. Inventories increase. The firm produces more. They put it in the warehouse because they haven't sold it yet. It does represent the opportunity to sell in the future. So we increase IG because of that. And then when it's actually sold, we reduce to make sure we're not double counting. Okay, moving on. Government spending, this is the big one when we're talking about macro because we're talking about the entire economy. And the government is a very significant force in maybe stimulating, also pushing government economic activity on its own. So, all levels of spending. So this could be city governments, this could be local governments, this could be the national or federal government. And typically in most countries, government does not produce goods and services itself. It produces services, so services that they provide to citizens, but a lot of times they need to spend money on education, on hospital supplies, because they don't produce these things themselves. The weapons, the uniforms, the food that they feed their soldiers, all of this they need to spend with private firms who produce it for them. So government spending is often a significant factor, and people who contract or create or sell to the government can be quite wealthy in some countries, because it can be a very lucrative situation if you are able to be the exclusive supplier to a government. Something to bear in mind if you are looking at business opportunities in the future. One thing that we do not include in the G category, and this is important to remember, is transfer payments. So transfer payments are typically those monies that the government collects from one party and distributes to another party. So typically the two big categories for this would be welfare payments and pension payments. So welfare payments, they're taking money in the form of taxes from people who have income and are paying taxes, and they often distribute that money to people in need. So depending on the country, each country has different policies on who receives those welfare payments, but it could be people who are unemployed, it could be people who are old, it could be people who are sick or on disability. But since the government is transferring the money from one party to another, we typically don't count them in GDP, because it's not money received or being paid in exchange for a good or service. It's just being moved from one party to the next. The other thing we exclude typically is pension payments, and pension payments are typically made to older, retired people who are no longer working. And we continue. Net exports, XN. So if you recall, tale of two boxes from before when we were talking about the US and China. So exports, again, adopting the US perspective, things produced in the United States, sent to other places, and in exchange, the US receives a flow of money. And then imports are the opposite. So it's goods and services produced in other countries. They are shipped or sent to the United States, and the United States pays money in return for those. All right, so coming back to our five-sector model, if you recall, Y, national income, the money received by households, so this is GDP, is equal to consumer spending, so the money that households spend on the firms, plus IG, plus government spending, plus net exports. So the five-sector model you learned before also captures the aggregate spending formula that we're learning here. Aggregate income, this one you will use less frequently. So aggregate spending is really the one that you will use most commonly for AP Macro. If you study economics in university, of course, you will probably delve deeper into both of these. So GDP measures both spending and income. Income really just talks about the rent, wages, interest, and profit. So those factor payments are what we mean when we talk about aggregate income. Again, not likely to show up for the AP, but you should know what we're measuring when we talk about measuring aggregate income. And this was in the circular flow that we talked about before.